Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the book launch of Momen2m, More Reforms for Economic Growth. I'm Tony Abad, and I will be your host and moderator today. For today's program, we will begin with welcome remarks from Calixto Chikiamco, co-author and president of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Then we will have a keynote address from Bangko Sentral Governor Benjamin Diokno. And then we have messages from 4 distinguished guests, and then the book reading from the authors. We will also have 15 minutes for Q&A with the authors and closing remarks, or maybe a closing number from our chairman, Sir Bobby De Ocampo. The Secretariat has informed us that those who will buy books today will get a signed copy, a limited number for a limited time offer. And then we have a few reminders before we begin. For Zoom participants, you may use the Zoom Q&A for your questions. For other comments and insights, you may type them in the chat box. The webinar is being recorded for documentation purposes, and the event is also being live streamed on our official Facebook page, Foundation for Economic Freedom. The link is shared by the Secretariat in the chat box. So to begin this program, may I give the virtual stage to Toti Chikiamco, our president and also the co-author of Momen2m, for his welcome remarks. Toti?
Friends, family, colleagues, and fellow reformers, good morning to you all. Welcome to the formal launch of the book Momen2m, More Reforms for Economic Growth. The book is appropriately titled Momen2m with Arabic numeral 2 because it's the second book from the articles of the authors, save for 2 new ones in BusinessWorld. To the list of first Momen2m authors, which include national scientist Dr. Raul Fabella, Dr. Noel de Dios, Romeo Bernardo, and myself, are 2 new authors, the eminent trade and agricultural economist Dr. Ramon Clarete and the international trade lawyer attorney Kristine Alcantara. The editor of the book remains Loel Landingin, and artist is Noel Agonoy. Our project coordinator is Ms. Rana Pintor. On behalf of my co-authors and myself, thank you for being here in this book launch. Why is it called Momen2m, aside from the fact that it's the second book after the first Momen2m? Is there still a momentum to the Philippine growth story in the first place, with the pandemic having ravaged the Philippine economy? We believe the Philippine growth story, despite the pandemic, still remains true, but the economy can only rebound, recover, and accelerate growth with more fundamental reforms. Hence the title. To the next administration seeking a roadmap of what to do to recover and rebound from this pandemic, we offer the book. This isn't a feel-good book, neither does it offer easy solutions, but it is serious, deep, and analytical. It is also timely and relevant because the country is looking for new directions due to the pandemic and with new political leadership just around the corner. We have invited our friends, thought leaders in their own right, from around the globe to celebrate this occasion by providing video commentary on this book. Later on, we shall hear from BSP Governor Benjamin Diokno, who will give the keynote address. Philam economist Dr. John Nye, the Bastiat Professor in Political Economy from George Mason University, Philippine Competition Commission Chairman Dr. Arsenio R.C. Balisacan, former BSP Governor Armando Sai Tetanco, and live from Tokyo, Japan, Professor Yusuke Takagi of the Graduate Research Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS. We thank them for their participation. Later on, after their testimonials, you will have a short book reading session with the authors reading a favorite portion from one of their articles. The audience will have a chance to engage with the authors in a short question and answer portion. The closing remarks in a lively entertainment number will be performed by the chairman of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, former Finance Secretary, Sir Roberto de Ocampo. Finally, as the acknowledgement section states, this book is a collaborative effort, not just by the authors, editor, and writers of this book, but also made possible by friends and supporters. Both the Institute of Development and Econometric Analysis, or IDEA, and the Foundation for Economic Freedom acted as co-publishers of this book. A number of institutions and individual friends, most of whom prefer to remain anonymous, made advanced purchases of the books. We promise to them that we will seek the widest distribution of this book as much as possible. It will be available through online platforms Shopee and Lazada, and we will donate to various schools and universities in the country. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you, Toti. Our next speaker, unfortunately, is not available to be with us live today, but the Bangko Sentral Governor, Ben Jokno, who also wrote the foreword for the book, will deliver his keynote address via recorded message. Ladies and gentlemen, Bangko Sentral of the Philippines Governor, Ben Jokno.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 2 years ago, I delivered the keynote speech during the book launch of Momen2m, Economic Reforms for Sustaining Growth. The book is a collection of newspaper columns written by public intellectuals and opinion leaders, Toti Chikiamco, Romeo Bernardo, Noel de Dios, Raul Fabella, and the late Dondon Paderanga. These columns serve as food for thought on key policy issues, which help readers make sense of the national economy. Today, I am pleased to join you again as keynote speaker for the launch of Momen2m's sequel, playfully entitled Momen2m, for which I was also privileged to write the foreword. Let me start with a recounting of where we've been since the first volume was launched, followed by my thoughts on how the Momen2m pieces are serious contributions to our crisis response and economic recovery. I will then close with some views on what lies ahead. Since the first Momen2m was launched in late 2019, we have all experienced disruptions, both in the national economy and in our personal lives. The Duterte administration first declared a Luzon-wide lockdown on March 17, 2020, to curb the spread of the COVID-19 virus. At the height of quarantine restrictions in the second quarter of 2020, the country's gross domestic product contracted by 17%. This was the largest quarterly decline since 1981. It was in this context that the BSP extended emergency financing to the national government through a repurchase agreement. To bolster the stability of the financial system and public access to financial services, the BSP also cut its policy rate and the reserve requirement, and provided banks with regulatory and operational relief measures. Further, the BSP considered loans extended by banks to MSMEs as part of their compliance to the reserve requirement, increased the single borrower's limit, and raised the ceiling for real estate loans. All told, as of October 2021, the BSP has injected 2.3 trillion pesos into the financial system. That's equivalent to 12.8% of the country's GDP. The Philippine Central Bank stands ready to continue doing whatever it takes on the monetary side of the recovery equation. And as I've said repeatedly, we will only implement a data-driven exit strategy from these measures when we are certain that the roots of economic recovery have firmly taken hold. While uncertainties caused by the pandemic remain, the columns in this collection shed light on where we've been as well as where we're headed. This compendium of ideas represents the views of some of our most distinguished economists, many of whom are my former colleagues at the UP School of Economics or acquaintances in government and reform advocacy circles. Their ideas serve as a renewable source of intellectual energy for maintaining the momentum of our economic reforms as we respond to and recover from the pandemic. A good example is Ramon Clarete's Which Curve to Flatten Over the Next Few Months, published in April 2020. He articulates the trade-offs between what he calls the infection and recession curves. Munching writes, open quote, "Our leaders and health experts do not know with certainty how much time they need to flatten the infection curve for good. But the longer they force people to stay home, they end up sharpening the recession curve." End quote. Indeed, we have slowly reopened the economy. The lockdown measures have resulted in flattening the infection curve and allowed the buildup of the country's healthcare capacity, COVID testing, contact tracing, patient care, and most importantly, our much improved and accelerated vaccination rollout. Let us not forget that the COVID-19 pandemic is primarily a public health crisis. However, the negative unintended consequences of the lockdown measures include severe adverse impacts on the lives and livelihoods of Filipinos, especially the poorest families. Romeo Bernardo's legislation in aid of investment jobs recovery, published in December 2020, cogently argues for key economic reforms as part of our pandemic recovery. Romeo advocates for amendments to the Foreign Investments Act, the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and the Public Services Act, as well as the ratification of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, or RCEP, among others. These measures are designed to attract more job-generating investments that will send a powerful signal of the Philippines' readiness to welcome more foreign capital to help with the post-pandemic recovery. Most of these measures are nearing the finish line. As a community of policy and practice, we share a common resolve to regain our economic momentum now and in the aftermath of this crisis. The technically sound, yet politically difficult proposals we find in Momentum will complement those in the first volume as a handy reference and playbook for the truly courageous change agents among us. It is heartening to note that our economy is indeed recovering, as shown by the solid rebound in GDP growth at 12% in the second quarter and 7.1% in the third quarter of this year. We expect the recovery momentum to continue as more Filipinos get vaccinated and improved virus containment enables more business activity to come back online, in some cases, literally. Various indicators back this positive outlook. For instance, manufacturing continued on its expansion mode as the country's PMI rose to its 8th-month high of 51.7 last month, from 51 in October and 50.9 in September. Also, Google mobility indices showed significant progress versus last year. As of December 4, visits to public transport stations were only negative 21% compared to pre-pandemic levels, vastly improved from negative 46% last year, while visits to the retail and recreation areas moved back to pre-pandemic level with an index of 3.7% versus a contraction of 34% last year. These developments give us confidence that the government's latest growth targets, set at 4 to 5% this year, 7 to 9% next year, and 6 to 7% in 2023 and 2024 are achievable. It is against this backdrop that the BSP is taking action toward a more sustainable future as we move from emergency responses to a pandemic to the day-to-day management of an endemic. The shift from paper to polymer banknotes and promotion of digital transactions are key examples of these initiatives. Next year, the BSP will circulate 1,000 piso polymer banknotes to determine whether the benefits experienced by other countries will bear themselves out in the Philippines. These benefits include, first, public health and hygiene because polymer notes can be sanitized easily, unlike paper. Second, more sophisticated security features can be embedded into polymer. Third, the longer lifespan of polymer banknotes, from 2.5 to 4.8 times that of paper, make them more cost-efficient, even after accounting for the higher production cost. And fourth, polymer can be fully recycled into other products, such as building materials and furniture. Fueled also in part by the pandemic, digital payments breached the 2020 target of 20%. Financial digitalization is a requisite feature of a new and better economy that will fuel growth and inclusion. Faster payment processing will help speed up capital turnaround and income growth as digital platforms hold the potential to make financial products and services accessible to the unserved and underserved. The view on the Philippines' prospects for full economic recovery within the short term is shared by relevant international observers. Despite a wave of credit rating downgrades and crisis, the Philippines has managed to keep its investment-grade ratings intact. As the country's central monetary authority, the BSP is committed to deliver on its mandate of promoting price and financial stability the BSP remains one with the national government in pushing the economy toward full recovery and building its resilience against future crises. To our dear authors, Toti, Romy, Raul, Monching, Noel, and Kristine, thank you for challenging us, but necessary, for the successful launch of Momen2m. May we keep the momentum going to achieve strong, balanced, and sustainable inclusive growth toward a new and better economy. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Governor Ben Jokno. Today, we are also joined by four special and highly esteemed guests, friends who have had a special sneak preview of Momentum, More Reforms for Economic Growth. Our first guest speaker is John V.C. Nye, Professor of Economics and the Bastiat Chair in Political Economy at George Mason University. His primary research interests include European economic history and new institutional economics. Dr. Nye is a founding member of the International Society for the New Institutional Economics. And as Professor Nye is based in the US, he will not be able to join us live today, but he has shared with us his special video message. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John Nye.
Good morning. I'm very sorry I cannot be there with you. The contributors to Momen2m, I believe to be some of my closest colleagues and friends in the Philippines, and I very much would have liked to share this moment with them, but for the problems caused by a certain Chinese export. This is a significant moment for the authors of this great effort in promoting good policy. What started out as a fine first volume is turning into a powerful duo of advice and cautionary speculation for the country. The authors include several of the most prominent economists and policymakers the Philippines has ever produced. They are aware of the fact that in many ways, the worst that has happened to the Philippine economy since liberation has been caused by the unfailingly bad policy that has been promoted, endorsed, and promulgated by virtually all of our leaders for the last 7 decades. No amount of corruption, tyranny, or incompetence could do as much harm to the country as the variety of regulations and policies that were seemingly designed to help the general public or the poor, but that in the end damaged almost everybody. Our Asian neighbors have zoomed ahead of the country in those decades, but as many of those neighbors have shown, whether in Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, or Singapore, well-chosen policies, properly enforced, can, in as little as a decade or two, reverse half a century or more of stagnation and even decline. But to improve, we must first admit we have a problem, look for relevant and effective solutions, and then find ways to implement them. With Momen2m, policymakers in the Philippines have another piece of the blueprint needed to make the necessary reforms. I congratulate you all. Merry Christmas. Mabuhay.
Mabuhay, John, and thank you. Our next esteemed speaker is also joining us via recorded message, and we have none other than former NEDA Secretary and now Chairman of the Philippine Competition Commission, Arsenio R.C. Balisacan.
My friends and colleagues, Kristine, Romy, Tuti, Ponching, Noel, and Raul, warmest congratulations to all of you on the launch of Momentum, More Reforms for Economic Growth. I'm most certain that much like your first book, published only 2 years ago, this sequel will prove useful to policymakers, practitioners, reform advocates, and teachers and students of development. I recall that at the launch of the first book, Tuti explained that the book was titled Momentum because many economic discussions happening then in and outside the book's pages were about how the Philippines can sustain and even accelerate the fast growth it experienced in the 2010s. Like the authors, I shared the excitement of what the next decade could bring and had high hopes for the country's future. But come 2020, we all know how the story took an unexpected turn, a plot twist, as the younger generation would say. Notwithstanding its so-called strong macroeconomic fundamentals, the Philippine economy has plunged to its worst post-war recession. More than a year later, the cloud of uncertainty surrounding the economy's trajectory lingers. And aside from the familiar supply and financial shocks, these days we face physical threats in the form of coronavirus variants and, of course, climate change. Further, with the national elections just around the corner, the question of how to get the economy back on its pre-pandemic track becomes extra crucial. I would hazard we would come up with as many recommendations to our predicament as there are economists in this virtual room. But I believe the first and most critical step is to start, or in some cases, restart the conversation. And here in the book being launched are 63 thought-provoking conversation starters that will surely leave readers with ideas that can generate additional ones, which in synergy can open the way forward for the country as it treads the uneasy path to recovery and post-recovery development. An interesting prospect is when Filipinos and observers of the Philippine economy look back on this book 10, 20, 30 years from now. What questions will they be asking? How different will the country's challenges be by then? Will they have learned from our mistakes, having listened to our author's deep musings and well thought out suggestions? More importantly, will we have regained our long desired momentum? I sincerely hope we will still be around by then to know the answers to these questions. For now, I'm just truly thankful to our authors for starting this meaningful and much needed conversation and raising the quality of public policy debates. I join you all in the pursuit of fostering ideas that enrich economic discourse as well as the lives of our fellow Filipinos. Again, my heartfelt congratulations to the authors and to FEF for this new book. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Chair RC. Our next guest speaker is former Bangko Sentral of the Philippines Governor, Amado Sai Tetanco.
Good morning, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure and privilege to be able to say a few words at this launching of the book Momen2m, More Reforms for Economic Growth. This book needed to be written and published. Steve Jobs was quoted as having said that the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. Indeed, we have in this book a band of authors dissecting issues of critical importance in our lives and those for our children and future generations. By delving into topics with thoughtful and provocative observations, the authors provide much food for thought for intellectual discourse. But beyond that, they can exert considerable influence in shaping our views on important economic and social concerns, whether or not we are in full agreement with their commentaries. The writing styles are fluid, the reading is easy, and most importantly, the substance of the various chapters is invariably rigorous and astute, coaxing the reader to pause and reflect and carefully consider the arguments presented. They engage the reader, stimulate the mind, and provide guidance for policy assessment and action. The book's title alone speaks volumes. It challenges us to think whether we agree with the underlying assumption of a momentum. One question that springs to mind is whether we are looking at a recovery without a takeoff, as one World Bank paper has postulated in reference to another group of countries. Is the scarring effect of the pandemic, such as on government debt, on private sector credits, on lost human capital accumulation, so deep that there is no momentum that can provide the fillip that can be leveraged upon? Exacerbated structural rigidities and highlighted governance challenges, as well as created new headwinds that would prove difficult to manage and overcome given limited policy space, especially for demand management and binding supply-side constraints. Remembering too that even before the pandemic, there have been long-standing social and economic issues that needed to be addressed urgently. On a more positive note, has the pandemic catalyzed the adoption of policies that would lead to permanent output gains that have ratcheted up the Philippine economy's productive potential and competitiveness over the longer term? This would include policies and programs on digitalization and innovative technologies, advances toward an energy efficiency agenda, including through green and blue finance, as well as reforms that have a more intensified focus on smart infrastructure investment, education, health, energy policy, and governance, the latter to reduce waste and leakage, while also confronting climate change challenges. Has creative destruction cleared the path for reforms that could support a more resilient, more inclusive growth path and a more strategic use of productive public and private resources? Have the past and ongoing challenges compelled or forced the markets to be more flexible and economic agents to be more adept at adjusting to the inevitable dislocations? The economic repercussions of the still unfolding pandemic are expected to last longer than the health impact. For this reason, I welcome very much the author's discussion on the key growth-advancing reforms that should be undertaken urgently in the context of available macroeconomic policy space. Congratulations to the book authors. This book is one that will surely be read with care and introspection, fertilizing the grounds for circumspect policy actions. The authors write powerfully to make change happen in the world. Change that is purposeful, change that is transformative, change that can hopefully, sustainably, and permanently raise economic efficiency, dynamism, and inclusion over time. I said earlier that this book needed to be written and published. I'll end by saying that this book needs to be read, and read with an open, curious, and discerning mind by all that care deeply for our society and our beloved country. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Sai. Now we are fortunate to have the next speaker, our next guest, joining us live from Japan. Professor Yusuke Takagi is Associate Professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Tokyo, Japan. Before joining GRIPS, he actually worked at De La Salle University, Manila, and the Embassy of Japan in the Philippines. He teaches graduate courses on political science, focusing on Southeast Asia, as well as other emerging countries. The floor is now yours, Professor Takagi. Dozo.
Thank you very much, Abado-san. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Following the esteemed guest, I'm actually the last and the least. So against that, maybe I need to project my institutional power by changing the background of my talk. This is my school. So first of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to join this book launch. And I do believe this book, Momen2m, and also the first one, Momen2m. I mean, these two books are quite important for us to understand the Philippine political economy. To put it in a very simple way, these books tell us two important things. The first, very simple one, is that the world is complex, and the dichotomy like DDS and Dilawan is not so helpful to understand actual Philippine politics and economy. But unfortunately, in media, we tend to be trapped in this kind of very much a simplistic dichotomous worldview, like, oh, if you are DDS, you are not Dilawan, or that kind of thing. Now, of course, seriously speaking, this is not enough. So we really want to know more about actual Philippine politics and economy. And these books are the very important venue for us to understand what's going on in the Philippines, and at the same time, what we should expect in the Philippines. And the Philippine economy has thrived thanks to the great mix of the people. Like this is my favorite line from these two books. I really appreciate the works by so-called Deng Xiaoping pragmatists, raging incrementalists, and the liberal Democrats. These people, these people worked for the reform for decades, I do believe. And these people's efforts have also shaped the reality of Philippine politics and economy. That's why I said that the dichotomous view is too simplistic. And the second point, which I got from the book, is very simple. Again, the simple one, but important. Just like as Governor Tetanco said, changes are happening. And the message we can get from the book or from the books is like, we can change the world. And the policy making is always essential. So the book describes the dynamic nature of policy making process in the Philippines, which is often open to advocacy from the CSO, like Foundation for Economic Freedom. And some people say that Philippine state is weak, but I rather argue that Philippine state is porous. In other words, policymaking process is open to various stakeholders. We tend to think about, the porousness. When we think about the porousness, people tend to look at cronies. Yeah, actually, it is true. But the other side of the same coin can be found the quite important advocacy from civil society organizations, which is a very dynamic aspect of Philippine economy and also politics. So by reading two books, we really know this kind of dynamic face of the Philippines. So I'm so happy to read actually the second one, Momen2m, and I expect that we will see Momen2m. I don't know how to say it now, but yeah, I'm sure we will learn more. And lastly, as a discussant and also as a political economist, let me ask several questions to open up the discussion later on. The question is based on my observation of Philippine economy or changing Philippine economy in Southeast Asia or East Asia or Indo-Pacific, the broader region. Many people say that the Philippines has finally turned itself from the segment of Asia to the latest Asian tiger. And what does it mean? I don't think it means only economic growth, but rather it means the establishment of the foundation of the rule of law. As Professor Fabella always say, rule of law is the foundation of free market economy. And if we can one step further, we can argue that Philippine economy has joined the club of Asian emerging economies. So what is the Asian emerging economy? To me, it means open economic regionalism. Asian economy has a long tradition of intra-regional trade, whose boundary has always blurred and open. Historically, the Chinese merchants, Indian merchants, or Arab merchants link this region to outside of the world. And after Europeans came to the region, most of them, mainly the British, did not entirely destroy, but rather revise the intra-trade network. In this context, we should now remember the very famous book of late great economic historian Benito Regalda, whose After the Galeons is still inspiring for our generation. And because of the porous colonial trade nature, another great historian, Edgar Wickberg, famously quoted Carlos Recul saying that Philippine Islands were the Anglo-Chinese colony with a Spanish flag in the 19th century. So if we go back to the 19th century, Philippines was located in open economic kind of regionalism. And after the World War II and the period of economic decolonization with the attempts of import substitution industrialization, some East Asian economies decided to open their economies to trade and investment. So Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore have become dynamic trade economies. And in the late 1980s, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia joined the club of East Asian Miracle. And unfortunately, Philippines at the time missed the train thanks to the dictator Marcos, in my view. But in the 2000s, China and Vietnam joined the move, especially after they joined WTO. And finally, in the 2010s, Philippines joined the club of dynamic emerging economies in East Asia. And as I said, rule of law is quite important to achieve this. And to make it possible, we have to think about the role of technocracy and the direction of technocracy toward open regionalism. And some may say if we study East Asia, while political leaders may be authoritarian, economic technocrats are always rational and working for institution making. And these technocrats always supported a basic idea of free market sustained by the rule of law, which is quite important. In line with this, about free market, I'm now very much curious about, of course, the ratification process of RCEP, but one step further, we now have CPTPP. And from Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Vietnam, needless to say, Singapore and Brunei, but Malaysia and Vietnam joined CPTPP. It's quite interesting to me because Malaysia is known for the affirmative action to the Malay majority people. And of course, we just need to say, but Vietnam is governed by Communist Party, but still they joined CPTPP. So how about the Philippines? And the next question is about political issue. I always emphasize the significance of rule of law and role of technocracy. These are quite important to achieve economic growth in this region. But I sometimes ask myself, is dense China still here, especially after Xi Jinping came to power? Dense China was very nice in a sense because he said that we have to keep a low profile until time has come. And for the Chinese leader, time may come if we look at South China Sea or India-China border. So these are my concerns. And what is the implication of promoting dense China in the context of US-China strategic rivalry? To put in a different way, how can we understand the issue of the value in this context of globalization maybe 2.0 in an age of US-China rivalry? And also, we should not forget about the movement of the so-called ESG investment. In the 20th century or early 21st century, we can forget about the value and the focus on economic growth. But these days, we have to think about kind of value-oriented issue. Some people may remember Summit for Democracy chaired by the United States last week. And also many people cannot forget about the movement of ESG if we want to get the investment. So the last question is a bit, I mean, there's no clear answer maybe, but free market, what is free market in this context? Is it value-free economy? Or how can we distinguish, freeness and liberal? These are the things that I'm thinking these days, and I'm sure the momentum and Momen2m are the foundations of our discussion, and I expect to read Momen2m in the near future. Thank you very much.
Domo arigato gozaimasu, Takagi Sensei. I will keep your questions to heart, no, and keep them in mind. It will guide us in our Q&A later. And thank you also to thank you again to our special guest speakers, John Nye, Chair RC, Governor Sai, and of course Takagi Sensei, for your testimonials about momentum, more reforms for economic growth. And now, to share with us some of the articles that they've written and what inspired them to write these, we will have a book reading session with our authors. If you have any questions for our authors, we will try to answer them during the Q&A portion. Now, our first three authors who are going to share with us are Kristine Alcantara, Romeo Bernardo, and Toti Chikiamco. Allow me to introduce them properly. My law partner, Kristine Francisco Alcantara, is a trade and technology and also competition lawyer, and is the managing partner of our firm, Abad Alcantara and Associates, and a member of the board of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Kristine is a staunch advocate of inclusive economic growth and sustainable development through free trade, gender mainstreaming, and innovation exchange. Next is my idol, Romeo Bernardo, who pivoted to a career in financial and economic consulting as co-founder of the Lazaro Bernardo Chu and Associates firm after 2 decades of public service, which included teaching at the University of the Philippines, assignments at the Philippine Mission to the United Nations, and the GATT in Geneva, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. And then, of course, rising to the position of Undersecretary of the Department of Finance. And our president, Toti Chikiamco, is a book author, political economist, and entrepreneur. He is a co-founder and president of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, which received the International Templeton Prize from the Atlas Network in 2019 for its reform work on agricultural free patents. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear from our first 3 authors of the book.
Hello, good day. Hi, I'm Kristine Alcantara, and I'll be reading excerpts from the article Our Brand is Crisis, Controversies, Challenges, and Opportunities in Pandemic Procurement. So this particular piece was inspired, as I'll quote, "For a nation obsessed with telenovelas, there's nothing more gripping and trebly dramatic as the agony ecstasy of a Senate Blue Ribbon Committee hearing on questionable purchases and deficiencies in compliance with procurement audits. Apart from, or maybe because of the escalating tensions brought about by the upcoming Philippine elections in 2022, corruption inquiries and allegations occupy the headlines and most of the chatter in social media. In the midst of a health crisis, the voting public wants to know just one thing: did anyone profit from the pandemic?" So this indeed is the big question. When the streets were washed with blood, who brought and flipped property? Since the exchange of vicissitudes and public recriminations outshadowed the purpose of the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee hearing, which is to spark reform on our procurement processes, allow me also to give my 2 cents on the matter. Here are some strategies in approaching urgent procurement. So one of which I'll quote from the article is to assess the adoption of critical and high-risk procedures for emergency procurement, improve on the regulatory framework on emergency procurement by amending the Philippine Procurement Act, or maybe by acceding to the Government Procurement Act of the WTO, strengthen and invest in our e-procurement systems, and provide clear and regulatory guidelines around emergency procurement. And let me also add, at the core of public procurement solutions, technology once again occupies a central component. So what if we use big data and analytics so we can bring about a new frontier with the premise of transformative changes in procurement, such as risk analysis, real-time performance outputs, or scorecards of suppliers, data mining on price trends, and predictive analytics on forecast spend and pricing. So let me conclude, as the article does also. The quality of institutions and the capacity of state governance is truly tested in times of contagion and calamity. Responsiveness and accountability can coexist in an emergency response, and the behemoth that is the government, with all its moving parts, can work in both national and granular level. After all, as Jane Bodine famously ends in the movie Our Brand is Crisis, if you don't like the road you're on, start paving one.
Good morning. Allow me to read excerpts from 3 columns. The first, December 2020, that is stimulated by the Philippines concluding negotiations on RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the doors this could open for spurring investments, jobs, and economic development. And I quote, to optimize its impact in attracting investors, many of whom are looking for new destinations due to the disruptions from COVID-19 and the US-China trade and tech wars, it would be ideal to package CREATE with a critical mass of other investment reforms that will demonstrate resolve. While a pandemic may not be a good time to be thinking of structural reforms, there may be an opportunity to ride on the recently signed RCEP. The RCEP binds its 15 signatories, i.e. the 10 members of ASEAN, Australia, China, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, which together account for 30% of global GDP and of world population. Analysis of RCEP suggests that the agreement's immediate value lies not in the incremental tariff reductions, which may take up to 20 years to implement, but in the promise of seamless production networks among the members who will be tied to common standards, disciplines on intellectual property, rules of origin, customs processes, e-commerce, and competition policy. Within this framework of stable and predictable rules, the Philippines could aspire to become a regional manufacturing and services hub, thereby creating much-needed domestic jobs. RCEP, with the lower tax regime under CREATE, along with the proposed amendments to the Public Services Act, the Foreign Investment Act, and the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, strung together, will send a powerful signal of the Philippines' readiness to welcome foreign capital to help with post-pandemic recovery, offering light at the end of the current gloomy tunnel. Former IMF chief Christine Lagarde used to counsel countries to fix the roof while the sun is shining. But for those who have spent a lifetime incrementally pushing reforms in the Philippines, one ought never to waste a good crisis. The second, triggered by red alerts on our power supply that prompted me to review EPIRA last June 2021, and I quote, I can only describe our regulators' approach as schizophrenic, where they have tended to over-regulate the competitive part of the industry and under-regulate the regulated part. EPIRA designed the power generation side to be competitive and allow competition to yield lower prices and higher reliability. Unfortunately, since then, the regulators have churned out regulation after regulation to curb the activities of generators. Each regulation is designed with the consumer in mind, but as with many regulations and laws, they often carry unintended consequences that distort the behavior and incentives of market participants. When investors do not build new plants or do so slowly because the business environment has been riddled with regulatory uncertainty and risk, and consumers and our entire economy lose. On the other hand, the regulators have fallen short in their responsibility to enforce the rules over NGCP, which has the monopoly over the transmission lines in the country. Over the past 10 years, it has not been fully compliant in the form of lack of transmission lines, a lack of redundancies in our network, a lack of power reserves. If we want to avoid power shortages, our regulator should focus on regulating the business of transmission of power and consider simplifying the rules for GenCos to allow the markets to work, to de-risk the environment, and to attract more long-term private capital. End quote. From power, let's move to the water sector. I wrote in Water Woes, Just the Facts, December 2019, alluding to the achievements of the highly acclaimed MWSS public-private partnership. Fidel Ramos wrote President Duterte on why our government needs to faithfully adhere to its contract investors if we are to successfully harness private sector know-how and resources to meet infrastructure needs. And I quote, "The private sector mobilized funding from foreign and local sources depending on the word of the Philippine government that the essential condition is adherence to the sanctity of contracts in the rule of law. These are the pillars that hold together any agreement, be it between governments and the government and the private sector. Our word must be our bond." End of quote from President Ramos. Thank you.
I'm a fan of economic history. I believe that the present is a product of the past. Understanding the present as a product of the past is a key to learning about our future. This is why one of my favorite articles is the one I wrote about the oligarchy during the Marcos regime and its economic impact. I outlined the economic history of the Philippines, tracing the misfortunes we have today to the original sin, the Belt Trade Act, under which the US granted the Philippines independence in 1946. Let me quote from the article. Quote, "The root of Marcos's rent-seeking oligarchy can be traced to the Belt Trade Act. The Belt Trade Act defined the trade relations between the US and the Philippines after independence. The Belt Trade Act required parity rights for Americans and removed exchange rate sovereignty from the new republic. That meant that the Philippines government wasn't free to set its own exchange rate. Thus, despite the fact that the Philippines was the most devastated country after World War II, after Poland, the United States decreed that the Philippines adopt the same exchange rate of 2 pesos for every 1 US dollar after the war and after independence, the same rate that prevailed before the war, as if no war or devastation had taken place. This was to ensure that Philippine exports could not compete with US agricultural products, since the US and Philippines had free trade 8 years after independence. This original sin, the gross overvaluation of the peso at the birth of the republic, spawned huge consequences on our economy and our institutions, the effects of which we still feel today, unquote. I conclude that article with the following passage, quote, "We can also ask why is it that 34 years after Marcos fell, we have this sense of deja vu. We have another authoritarian with fascist tendencies as a leader, and who, like Marcos before him, had ABS-CBN shut down. The answer is because the rent-seeking system persists. We still have an inward-looking economy. Our constitution is protectionist, as our previous constitutions dating back to 1935. Our percentage of exports to GDP is the lowest in ASEAN. Our oligarchy is mainly in regulated service industries, such as power, telecommunications, shipping, ports, and in other non-tradables, where their interest is in regulatory capture and weak government institutions. Furthermore, monopolies dominate the economy. We have the most concentrated economy in Asia, according to the World Bank. Nothing much has changed in agriculture, despite land reform. Rural poverty and agricultural stagnation persist. In the political sphere, we only have formal democracy, but political institutions are controlled by political dynasties. At the end of the book, apparently despondent that nothing much was being done about corruption, even by so-called reformists, Manapat poses the question whether corruption is inherent in human nature. I will answer Manapat, if he were alive today, that no, the fault lies not in ourselves, but in our history. We are just path dependent. We are the creatures of our past. Unquote.
And thank you very much for our first set of authors, Kristine, Romy, and Toti, who gave us some very precious insights on, well, innovation in the rule of law, proper regulation, and of course, political economy as seen through economic history. To our attendees, if you have any questions for our authors, please type them up in our Q&A section. Now we will have a book reading from a next set of co-authors, Ramon Clarete, Emmanuel de Dios, and Raul Fabella. Allow me to introduce them. Ramon, or Monching Clarete, is currently Chief of Party of the Be Safe project, working under Winrock International. Before this, he was a professor and a former dean of the University of the Philippines School of Economics, intermittently providing consultancy services to several government agencies. Still a professorial lecturer at UP, his teaching and research work focus on trade and industrial policies, agriculture and food, and public sector. Emmanuel, or Noel de Dios, is a professor emeritus at the University of the Philippines, where he served as dean of the UP School of Economics from 2007 to 2010. It's written on institutions and economic development, political economy, the history of economic thought, international economics, and the theory of individual choice. And Raul V. Fabella, who now holds the rank of National Scientist since 2011, is a professor emeritus at the University of the Philippines and still occasionally teaches at the UP School of Economics, where he was a former dean. He is now a member of the National Academy of Science and Technology and an honorary professor at the Asian Institute of Management. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear from this next set of co-authors, Monching, Noel, and Raul.
I am reading from an article I wrote on agriculture and economic recovery. Perhaps I should have titled that article, Rediscovering Agriculture's Strong Contribution to the Economy. There are reasons to believe that the coming new year might likely bring some happiness for many of us Filipinos. The economy had a fantastic 7% growth in the third quarter, a precursor of a stronger economy in the coming year. Economic managers, however, had set their eyes on a modest growth of perhaps less than 6%. But what's agriculture's contribution to the expected stronger growth of our economy? Sadly, little. Or it proved to be a drag to an even stronger economic growth. Over the past 2 decades, its growth had significantly declined. The disparity between GDP and the gross value added growth from agriculture widened. Ironically, that was when the economy had become one of Asia's best performers. Agriculture growth was not pulled up by the higher growth in manufacturing and services in the last decade. The average growth of agriculture was 3.5% from 2001 to 2010 and fell to 1.9% in the last decade. In contrast, GDP expanded from an average growth of 5% to the earlier decade to 6.3% from 2001 to 2019. If agriculture is going to make a significant contribution to economic recovery, it should recover its growth performance several years back. But what should authorities do to realize that? I associate this lackluster growth of agriculture to falling tradability of the sector and fragmentation of farmlands. Agriculture's share in total export used to be 64% of total in the 1960s. 2 years ago, it fell to only 8%. True, we now have a more diversified export basket compared to the 1960s, but agriculture export share in gross value added of the sector had likewise fallen, indicating weakened capacity of the sector to export. In the 1960s, that used to be a third and fell to 1.6% in 2019. We tend to be overly protective of our local producers. We tend to be mercantilist, saying it is all right to maximize our exports, but we've got to minimize our food imports at whatever cost, even if it means higher food costs for our people. It is a big mistake. Countries that tend to be more open to import competition in food and agriculture products are those that succeed in increasing their agricultural exports, garnering positive net exports, and have stronger contribution of agriculture to overall economic growth. Secondly, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, or CARB, is the Trojan horse in Philippine agriculture. It had ironically hurt more than helped poor farmers. No one can own more than 5 hectares, and the average farm size shrank to a hectare per household. What modernization, what efficiency can we expect from agriculture under CARB? Nothing, as we have seen in the last quarter of a century. Agriculture land markets have got to be deregulated to enable scale economies and attract private sector investments in agriculture. So, as we prepare to greet the coming new year with fresh hopes for a stronger economy, as we prepare for an election year, let us look to 2 fresh ideas to rediscover the strength of the farming and fisheries sector. Make the sector more tradable and end CARB.
Something has bothered me for some time, and that's the deteriorating quality of political discourse in our country. and what it means for the development of a fledgling democracy. Almost everyone, I think, is aware of the political polarization that's now typical of our political life. For example, notably, between the supporters of the administration, derisively called Dutertards, and those of the opposition, the Dilawan. And now, between supporters of Bongbong Marcos and those who oppose the complete rehabilitation of the Marcos family and their return to the highest office. I tackled this at some length in a column entitled Agora, the Shrinking Public Square, where I recount the story of Hypatia in ancient Greece, who was the victim of growing intolerance and extremism. The strange villain of the piece in this case being fanatical Christians who could not tolerate unenlightened paganism. I tell this story as an extreme example of what might result when people retreat into their respective ideological echo chambers and try to shut out or outshout others' opinions, a result incompatible with the idea of a deliberative democracy. At around this time last year, I came across the work of Sean Rosenberg, a political scientist, who shockingly predicted the end of liberal democracy because its requirements seemed overly complicated, while populism, arguing with simple us versus them propositions, appeared simpler and more attractive psychologically. I quote from the column, "What Sean Rosenberg terms communicative engagement aims at arriving at a shared understanding of issues and circumstances so that the individuals involved can come to agreement on the actions they should collectively take. While citizens may differ in their personal frames of reference, they are still required to understand the bases for others' positions, that moral sentiment that Adam Smith called sympathy, and indeed remain open to the possibility of incorporating some elements of the other's viewpoints in one's own understanding." The column continues, "Hence, for example, the Dilawan should ideally not simply deny, but seek to understand the Duterte concern for the local peace and order and drug problem. Conversely, the latter should appreciate the former's concern that an indiscriminate drug war would violate human life and dignity, particularly among the poor and marginalized. In the ideal outcome, collective action could have resulted in addressing the drug addiction problem in a manner that respects human rights. Whatever shape of policy is finally adopted, however, what one seeks to avoid is a gravitation to extremes, encouraging instead a willingness to learn from errors and adjust future actions," end quote. I was struck by the requirement Sean Rosenberg mentions that there be shared understanding of issues and circumstances. And it occurs to me that this has been gradually denied us at this time by the rise of social media, which facilitates our hiving off into our own little partisan communities that algorithmically reinforce our biases and make us vulnerable to the spread of outright lies and revisionist propaganda. We have not helped our cause by directly suppressing mainstream media, chief of which has been the denial of the franchise of a main source of news like ABS-CBN. Finally, there is the overall cultural depreciation of intellectual and expert opinion in the political sphere and our country's sad state of literacy. And so the column concludes thus, and I quote, "The public sphere is being narrowed by direct suppression of its traditional venues, made even worse by the physical isolation imposed by the pandemic and their superficial replacement by algorithmic engagement in social media. The net result is to foster social division and worse, to make the majority of citizens lose interest in and turn away from substantive political issues altogether. This can only serve those whose agenda is to deprive ordinary citizens of initiative and to maintain the monopoly of information and power for themselves." That's how the column ends. With the deteriorating state of our political culture, I have reason to worry about the coming elections and beyond. Thank you.
What does Vietnam teach us about economic growth? In Vietnam Rising, I wrote, and I quote, The great buzz in the COVID-19 pandemic era, apart from the COVID-19 crisis itself, is how Vietnam is doing it. Ruchir Sharma asks in the New York Times, is Vietnam the next Asian miracle? In 2020, Vietnam is set to grow at 3%, while the Philippines is set to contract at 9%. But there's no mystery about how Vietnam is doing it. Sharma states it plainly, and I quote, "For now, Vietnam looks like a miracle from a bygone era, exporting its way to prosperity." Vietnam's recipe for success is the very same one that was written by the East Asian economic miracles. That is the East Asian model. Multinational corporations of every stripe and color are flocking to Vietnam's export processing zones, Chinese multinationals included. Vietnam knows China is the template, and that means going big on slipstream industrialization as an export platform. Vietnam's exports grew on average 16% a year for 2 decades now, twice the growth of the Philippine exports of 8.5%. Today, about 80% of Vietnam's exports come from companies with FDI roots. Why is manufacturing exiting the Philippines? On the exodus of manufacturing, I wrote, and I quote, Nissan Philippines closed its Santa Rosa, Laguna assembly plant in March 2021. Honda Cars Philippines shuttered its Santa Rosa, Laguna plant in February 2020. Ford Motor Philippines closed its assembly plant in 2012. Though car assembly plants are headed for the door, Nissan, Honda, and Ford cars will still grace the showrooms. Only now the cars are or will be imported. For all of manufacturing, not just car assembly and oil refining, the truth is the opposite of our vaunted tourism slogan, more fun in the Philippines. The list of countries identified by Bergsten and Gagnon as currency manipulators, Japan, China, Denmark, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, India, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, and now Vietnam, is a veritable honor roll of countries in the pink of economic health. These countries deliberately leaned on a pro-tradable ecology to attract foreign direct investors, grow their exports, resulting in large trade surpluses. Shouldn't the Philippines be aspiring to join the exalted ranks of currency rogues? Unquote. That's it. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Monching, Noel, and Raul. Again, very thought-provoking pieces. We have some important lessons to take away about pragmatic approach to agriculture. Open agriculture will actually lead to agricultural export and competitiveness. That we have to pay attention to our politics. That our political system cannot be looked at in a vacuum, and that we cannot ignore the fact that it affects our economic system. And finally, I think Raul, just by pointing out the important lessons that Vietnam can share with us, is already giving us plenty of advice on how to move forward. Now, before we jump into the Q&A portion with our authors, let me share where our attendees, where our participants can purchase the Momen2m More Reforms for Economic Growth. These, yes, So the book is now available for sale in FEF's Shopee and Lazada stores. These are the QR codes. The links are also shared by the Secretariat in our chat box. I'm informed that we have very limited copies of signed books for sale today. So I suggest you go and get them before they run out. For any issues with Shopee and Lazada, please post your SOS in the chat box. And our Secretariat, Anika, Angela, Marianne, Malu, and Aimee will assist you. The authors at this point would also like to thank the sponsors who've made advanced purchases of the book. Thank you so much for your support for this book project. An e-publication version of this book will also be available soon on Amazon Kindle. That's what I'm going to be looking forward to. So now let's move on. We go to the open forum, or our Q&A portion, where our participants and our earlier speakers may ask questions, okay, and our authors will be able to answer. May I now request all our authors to turn on their videos, and let me fire the first salvo just to set the mood. Well, I will also have a special question that I will be asking. But first, let me ask each of the authors, what will be your top 3 concrete recommendations as priority actionable economic measures for the next administration? Maybe let's begin, ladies first.
Or alphabetically, either that. Yeah, first in the row. So I think my recommendation to the aspirants or the candidates running is to have a specific strategy for investments in trade, digitalization, and sustainability. So particularly, we need to have a concrete action plan for attracting capital, so both from domestic and foreign sources, and ensure that there's relative ease in setting up a business. So we also need to welcome all forms of investment and balance the risks by a post-security review. And for digitalization reforms, I think we must also need to ask, like for example, how are the bills in open access to data and Public Service Act doing in Congress? And are we investing enough in digital infrastructure? So, and then finally, we also need to review our economic, I think, policy, especially for the candidates on their strategies. Are we serving the underserved or unserved? How are we targeting women or empowering women, youth, and those in rural areas? And is the Philippines really small business friendly? So I think that's my top 3 investments: trade, digitalization, and sustainability.
Thank you, Kristine. How about my idol, Romy?
Thank you, Attorney Tony. Excellent question. My column last Monday talked about 10 wish lists for the next administration. I'm not going to read all of the 10, but I will choose three there. Number 1, liberalize key segments of the economy. Number 2, address our country's future energy security. And number 3, revive the PPP model of infrastructure development. If you will allow me just to elaborate just on one of them, on the PPP model. And you can read this in my BusinessWorld column, the column that we share, all 6 of us. Let me just go to it. Sorry. Revive the PPP model of infrastructure development to accelerate both physical and digital infrastructure investment. 1, accept and process unsolicited PPP proposals, especially mature ones that the current administration was unable to evaluate and pursue, while a new pipeline of solicited projects is being developed. In addition, convert back to PPP projects that were redirected for ODA, particularly Chinese ODA, and government procurement. For example, the new water resources, the Kaliwa Dam and regional airports. Number two, consider major tweaks in PPP policy, including those that may require legislation, particularly on proper risk allocation. For example, the stringent material adverse government action, MAGA, which remain as an obstacle in pursuing PPP due to unacceptably high regulatory and political risk. Furthermore, be open to PPP solutions that go beyond what is provided in the BOT law to address critical national and local needs in public health, digital transformation, and ease of doing business. Thank you.
And now, Toti.
My first recommendation would be to remove the foreign ownership restrictions in the Constitution. As the columnist Bu Chanko said, the Filipino first philosophy in the 1987 Constitution made Filipinos last. So I think we need to remove those restrictive provisions in our Constitution. Second, we should pay attention to agriculture, especially because of rising food prices and which impacts the most on the poor. So what I would recommend would be to amend CARP so that agribusiness can be promoted, which is to remove the 5-hectare retention limit and maybe increase it to at least 24 to 25 hectares. Third is labor market reform. Principally, I think the Congress should pass an apprenticeship law. We should get the private sector to be involved in the education of the workforce. So those are my top 3 recommendations.
Thank you, Toti. Monching.
Thank you, Tony. I would repeat my 2 recommendations in my column and duplicating also what Toti just mentioned. Number 1 is just to start with the comprehensive agrarian reform. I support that one. I'll just add a little bit. Now that we have distributed the lands, we could probably also think about strengthening our legal system in order to have proper incentives for small farmers to group themselves together into clusters so that their individual rights are protected in this. My point is there must be some scale economies. We don't have to consolidate all lands. We could just manage our farming sector in a collective way through creative organizations of small farmers. But we have to introduce laws so that there will be protection of their individual rights. Number 2, bring down trade protection of all agricultural products down to the lowest possible. I think that's, for me, a very important recommendation that the next government should do. Vietnam, let's follow Vietnam. Vietnam has brought down to 5% all its corn, livestock products. If we don't follow that, we will be subject to smuggling from Vietnam of these meat products. I think in addition to that, help the export sector meet the standards of our trading partners. That's all.
Noel, I know you had a special answer, a special question, or special advice pala.
No, I agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said. I'd just like to point out the reality of the Philippine economy today, which is that it's primarily a services economy. And it is that primarily because of the success of the tradable services, like actually the BPOs are one. And then you don't tend to think about it, but the overseas Filipino workers are also a tradable sector. that has produced a huge bumper of foreign exchange for the economy. So taking that into account, the real problem is how to graduate to the next level of services. I take Raul's point that we ought to push manufacturing as far as we can. But if we take the structure of the economy as it is now, the bulk of employment is actually not in agriculture and not in manufacturing, but already in services. So that investment, understood more broadly, has to take the form of technology upgrade in services, education, and training. That is what is needed by any administration to push the economy to sustain, first of all, the stability that it enjoyed right before the economic crisis. A second one is obvious that if we are to attract foreign investment, we have to fix the rule of law and governance issues that plague the economy, especially under the Duterte administration. Prior to that, from 2010 up to 2017, actually foreign investments in the country have grown eightfold. It was only in after 2017 that began dropping. And I think it's no accident that it is because of the questions regarding security of investment and the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts, as exemplified by, the going back on the contracts with the water concessionaires and the removal of the franchise of firms like ABS-CBN, that foreign investors lost confidence in the Philippines. And that's quite apart, although I agree that we should liberalize the formal rules. But more than that, we should first of all rededicate ourselves to a rule of law. But that also means going back to a regime of human rights. And that was my point in the earlier column. Unless we can do that, then my third, unless we can do that, then my third priority for the next government, given what the surveys are saying, is for it to resign if it cannot do that.
There you go. Okay, how about Raul?
Thanks, Noel, for the last line. Moving forward, I would like to see a pivot to a pro-tradable ecology. Tradables include not only manufacturing and agriculture, but also tradable services. And also, I'd like to emphasize that pro-tradable ecology includes not only the exchange rate and the value of the peso, it includes so much more than that. For example, on the power cost, the power cost to manufacturing and tradables can be lessened by sparing these activities from equity and cross-subsidy and other costs, apart from generation and distribution. And this is not very strange. Germany does it already. Also, part of the power cost, that is on the part of the government. On the part of the private sector, power cost can be trimmed by new technologies whose economics has now become partners of Mother Earth. That is solar PV, especially rooftop-mounted solar PV by business establishments. You can save on transmission costs. You can save on other costs associated with passing the buying power from the transmission, power transmission. The second one is like Toti's. Please, please create an environment where private capital can return to the farm sector. The farm sector has always been orphaned by private capital simply because of the rules that have been imposed. Pass the House Bill 9955, whose features were already mentioned by Toti. Increase the ceiling for land ownership from 5 to 25, and the ceiling from land ownership from 5 to maybe 500 for firms that are registered with the Philippine Stock Exchange. And finally, on the rule of law, there is, of course, an aspect of the rule of law which has to do with contracts. And that has been mentioned already. That is extremely important. But I will also mention the rule of law that has something to do with politics. If I am convicted of tax evasion, I will never be able to hold public office. Will the Supreme Court, the guardian of the rule of law, to whom so much would be owed in our future, would they allow the charmed, connected people, convicted people, to hold public office? Please uphold the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you to our authors for that first round of answers. We have a question that came in the Q&A box. Let me read it. Congratulations to the authors. Have we sufficiently provided an enabling environment for local agricultural producers, e.g. infrastructure, logistics, rules to encourage mechanization, economies of scale, etc., to level the playing field versus foreign producers? I guess, what other laws need to be passed to ensure local agri-producers can compete on a level playing field with their counterparts who typically enjoy subsidies, incentives? So, Monching, I think this is the typical argument, well, why we want to stay where we are in agriculture, because we're not ready. But I think what you had mentioned earlier, actually quite the opposite. No? Yeah, Monching. And anyone else who can answer this question?
Well, just to repeat again what I just said, I think the fragmentation is really very serious in agriculture, and there's no way we can actually move growth in agriculture with this fragmented ownership of land. We really need to get scale economies enabled in agriculture, and let private capital, as mentioned by Raul and Toti, to flow back into the agriculture sector. And the other part of my recommendation was really open up to provide competition. I think it's not so much the fact that we love foreigners to come in or foreign products to come in. This actually provides competition and pressure on existing domestic producers to be efficient, and at the same time to also read what new technologies in other countries they can profit from.
Okay. Anyone else want to answer? Yeah.
Local farmers want some protection. We could have an undervalued exchange rate. The protection should come in the form of the exchange rate, not in terms of quantitative restrictions. But I understand, of course, the problem is they fear, of course, the government will not be able to step up and help them. So that's why I think the exchange rate should be the protection for our local farmers. But at the same time, we should free the land market. Because the only way we really can compete is really through, applying management, science, and technology to agriculture. You can't compete with subsidies. That will only make you weak, I think we should therefore have a free market, in land to be able to compete.
Thank you, Toti. Anyone else? I doing a time check now. I think we're behind schedule, and we should be closing soon. So perhaps one more question.
Monisberto seems to have a
comment.
comment.
Well, we have some comments coming in the chat box. Well, we can. What did Mon say? Foreign investment and competition is fine, but what if a foreign country with an expansive foreign policy is running your national power grid? Guess we'll have to guess what country that is. Romy,
I don't know.
might want to comment on this because it's about our regulation.
Well, in my view, the national grid should have never been privatized in the first place because it's a natural monopoly. There's only one, so it should have really been not privatized. But we have to accept reality. That's it. Then you deal that with laws, on national security. But that should not be any reason to say all foreigners should be barred from investing in the country. Again, this is what my friend said, the zombie argument. The zombies will be coming, and therefore let's ban all of them. I think this is really a poor argument for against liberalizing the laws on foreign investment.
Yeah, we should let the good zombies in, no, Toti.
Since you called me out, Tony, I just like to say one of my columns is in fact on the regulation of power. So I'd invite Mon, hello, Monisberto, to check it out. And to me, it's not so much the question of ownership, but the fact that it is properly regulated. And my own observation is that as I said in the remarks that I read, and it's in my column, what we have is a lopsided regulatory regime. All of the regulation is heavily weighted on the part of the sector that is supposed to be competitive, rather than on the one where you have a monopoly. The monopoly is what you have to regulate, and there. It's really written in my column, and it's in the book. So that would be I don't want to be a spoiler. If you get the book or you can download it from BusinessWorld, I have more details there. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Mon.
Hello.
Just one last thing. I think ownership doesn't guarantee that you'll have security for your national grid. You could do that with a cyber attack. The Russians have been able to interfere in US elections. They've been able to penetrate even banks and even the power grid in the US through cyber attacks. So ownership is not really a guarantee that you will be safe from foreign threats.
I'd like to.
Hello, Tony.
I'm
sorry. Sorry.
I'd like
Hello,
to-
Tony.
Go ahead.
Ladies first.
Ladies first, Kristine.
Actually, I have a specific article also, like Boss Romy, on the politics of open economy and national security. So it's the common misconception. It's a zero. It's actually more of a positive sum game that you have to increase capital inflow first, and then it's going to be balanced by the strength of a nation's infrastructure, government, and institutions. So, for example, you allow the investment to come in, and then you police it or you regulate it when it's already inside. So, because we need the capital to build this infrastructure to make sure that we're actually secure from cyber attacks, but we just keep shutting off capital, then we're never really going to improve on our digitalization effort. Strong enough institutionally as a country to actually provide a security plan. So that's also part of the recommendations, that we need also to have a security plan, but it's not necessarily a counter argument, at least for investments. So.
Thank you. Raul?
Hello, Tony. I'll be more homey. In my younger days, I lived as a poor guy. Still I'm poor, at Bliss. You know what Bliss is? Bliss is a high-rise apartments that was constructed during the Marcos administration. And on Saturday mornings, I would look out my window just to see what's happening. And I see some guy in a brie hat, and he was planting his garden, a small piece of land beside his apartment. Then, just a short distance away, I see a lot of Filipinos. They were playing pusoy. That's their morning routine. And all the children were around them, learning from what they see. The guy who had on a buri hat happened to be Japanese. He was not Filipino. He was married to a Filipino, but he was tending his garden. So my philosophy from then on was, to him belongs the land who can make the land flower, not who has a political clout. Thank you.
Thank you for that gem of wisdom, Raul. And thank you also, Romeo has reminded us, if you want answers to your questions, you just have to buy the book. It's all there. Now, we are running close to the end of our event. And I guess I just have one more, give an opportunity for one more question. And Raul mentioned a Japanese gentleman tending a garden. But I wanted to ask our Japanese guest, Takagi Sensei. You had question at the end of your address. Would you like to ask our authors a question or questions before we end?
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. Yeah, what I've said is that Philippines joined a kind of club of East Asian miracle thanks to the technocracy. In my understanding, the rule of law is, of course, very important. But now we have to go a bit further to think about the different value. Rule of law is a quite important norm, but at the same time, as Professor De Jos said, that we have to think about human rights, or sometimes we have to think about accountability or democracy. But these issues are quite tricky in a sense, because it's very much, it can be politicized easily. So how can we deal with this kind of agenda? Or should we forget about this? I don't think so, but we don't know, unlike rule of law, we don't have a clear direction to achieve accountability or human rights and other political values. So what do you think about this kind of value in your policy proposal? This is my question.
Thank you, Professor. Any one of you, any one of the authors can answer this.
Hello, Tony.
Yes, Raul.
Previously, Takagi Sensei mentioned, asked a question about how tiger is the Philippine economy. And I noted that. So my own answer to that is, and I will not address his current question, but how tiger is the Philippine economy. My own answer to that is, it's too premature to make that judgment. In the 1990s, the Philippines was dumped called a tiger, a baby, a tiger cub. And there was a lot of excitement about that. But it came to grief during the Asian economic crisis, and that just simply sank to nothing. So my answer to the very first question that he asked is that, yes, we are not yet a tiger. That is still our aspiration at the moment. Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
What you-
well,
Go
my
ahead.
answer to Prestagati is how do you keep the question of how do you keep democracy, human rights, and at the same time become a tiger economy, considering that most of our ASEAN neighbors actually achieve tiger status through a authoritarian governments. Vietnam, China, Taiwan. So to me, the key question is really the key answer is really to we really need to amend the 1987 Constitution and make the economy more outward looking. Because to me, monopolies are the reason why there is this rent seeking, the corruption, the lack of absence of rule of law. As Dr. Fabella said, under the system, laws are for sale, especially when you have the monopolies. It is not in the interest of monopolies to have a rule of law, but to penetrate the state. As I said, it's very porous and to make it corrupt. So what I would do as the other countries like is really to make the economy outward looking, and really complete the agricultural revolution, because you really need a rising rural middle class to really strengthen your democracy. Unfortunately, we have much poverty in the countryside, and that is again because of the restrictions in CARP. I think the first stage of social justice they have been achieved. Let's go to the next stage, which is to modernize our agriculture and build a strong rural middle class for our democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Toti. I hope your questions were answered, Takagi Sensei. Hi. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now close this Q&A session. Remember, you all. Oh, Raul, did you want to say something? You're on mute. You're on mute.
To a large extent, politics agnostic. When Emperor William of Prussia was the last word in Prussian politics, he set up the law courts, so-called. It was the first country who set up the law courts. And one day, when he was traveling through his realm, he slept overnight in a castle, and he couldn't sleep simply because there was a mill that was making grinding throughout the night. And he became very angry. And he came down the next day and said, I want to buy you. And the farmer said, no, I won't sell. Don't you know, he said, that I am the emperor of Prussia? And the farmer said, but in Prussia, we have courts of law. Namataan ang emperor. And he said, okay, we'll follow the guidance of the courts of law. That's what I'm saying, that the courts of law can be, if given enough elbow room, can lead the country to greater heights. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. And that we can end with that thought about the value of the rule of law and also the value of our political system and our constitution, something that we should take, I think it's time to take a long, hard look at the way we are set up politically and not divide it between politics and economics, but actually the two work very closely together. And thank you again to our authors for answering questions from the floor. And now I will close this Q&A session, and we are about to close our event with, of course, closing remarks that we've been looking forward to, closing remarks or possibly a closing number from our chairman and balladeer, Roberto Bobby de Ocampo. Sir,
Thank you very much, Tony. There isn't really much I can add to what everybody has already said. I can only give my thanks to those that we invited to give their inputs, and my congratulations to those that had been involved in producing Momentum. It is a serious book, but not depressing. It should be taken seriously because it is full of expressions of moving forward. But those that decide to take its advice should not take themselves seriously. They should take the issue seriously and move forward. It is in the best traditions of FEF and makes me even prouder and honored to be the chairman of FEF. It reflects our raging incrementalism and, of course, our cautious optimism. We should always be optimists. Let us not despair about our country, and let us keep soldiering on. So in that note, let me close with this short number, which I hope is appropriate. And I hope I can soldier on with this one, even though I had been struggling with a mild sore throat the past few days. When you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you. When you're laughing, the sun comes shining through. But when you're crying, you bring on the rain, so stop crying. Be happy again, keep on smiling. 'Cause when you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you. All right. That's my little optimistic number for today. Congratulations, everyone. Keep soldiering on. Merry Christmas.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a number. And you notice the authors are all sort of tearing up while you were singing. We should ask them to sing the next event. All right, and that ends our program. Thank you very much for everyone for participating and being with us here today. And thank you for joining this book launch. I give congratulations to my colleagues in FEF. These are co-authors of this book. And we hope that everyone will join their call for reform. That it doesn't end here. It just goes on, and we soldier on. And please don't forget to grab a copy of the book, because all the answers to your questions are there. So this has been Tony Abad, and this has been the book launch of Momentum: More Reforms for Economic Growth. Thank you again. Merry
Thank you,
Christmas.
Tony.
Thank you so much, Tony. Wonderful,
safe.
as always.
Wonderful
Merry
song,
Christmas.
Chairman. Merry
Chairman,
Christmas.
salamat, Bobby.
Wonderful song.
Salamat.
Thank you very much.
Nakakayak. Happy holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.